Good morning. Fret not, I'm not about to attempt to deliver a sermon up here. As was mentioned earlier, today is Juneteenth, June 19th. It's also Father's Day. Juneteenth doesn't always fall on a Sunday, it's always June 19th. It's a federal holiday, so many of you, if you are not working tomorrow because of Juneteenth, it's because it's celebrated on Monday as a federal holiday, but the actual Juneteenth is today. So in honor of this day, Pastor Doug asked me if I would read an excerpt from Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail, which is a very famous piece of writing. It's a very long piece of writing, and so you may have read some or all of this at some point. I'm going to be reading an excerpt from it. This was a letter that was written in April of 1963, which was just a few months before Martin Luther King's famous I Have a Dream speech and the March on Washington. Many of us were around then. Not all of us, I'm sure. And actually, 1963, so that was 1 year before the passage of the Civil Rights Act. And just to create some context here, Martin Luther King was in Birmingham. He was a preacher at that time. And he had just been jailed for his participation in some anti-segregation protests. And he was being urged by some of his fellow clergy people, what you might call moderates, to kind of ease up a little bit. He was being urged to cancel additional protests that were being planned. And this letter is his response to those requests, and also his reaction to some of the things that were going on in Birmingham at the time. So before I actually get into the letter, and since I have the heart of a teacher, I can't resist introducing things, right? That's what we do. I want to just say a little bit about what I thought about as I responded to Doug's request that I read this letter. First of all, Juneteenth is a day of remembrance. It's about remembering the past. And this letter also serves as a little snapshot of what was going on, and especially what one of our great Christian leaders, Martin Luther King, was thinking about at that time. And so this reminds me about how a lot of our Christian heritage is about memory. And often it's memory of difficult things. As you will hear in this letter, there are some difficult things to hear. The Old and New Testaments both are accounts of memories. The two readings that Ellen shared with us this morning were both memories that were written down. In fact, the story from Luke is found in 3 different Gospels. So it's a memory that 3 different people recorded in slightly different ways. And we have lots of other memories. Memories of exile, memories of the life of Christ, memories of his words, his arrest, his crucifixion, his resurrection. The stories we have of those are all written down by people who are either remembering them directly or have heard them from someone else, and they were passed down as memories. So in the same way, Juneteenth is about memory. Specifically, Juneteenth is a commemoration of June 19th, 1865, which is the day that enslaved people in Texas, specifically, found out that they were free. The Civil War had already ended several months before, and, the internet had not come to Texas yet, and, nobody had Instagram or Facebook accounts, and they literally did not know. And it wasn't until some Union troops, I guess, maybe some of you know the history better, actually came to Texas and said, hey, guess what? And that was June 19th, 1865. So that's why that's celebrated. And originally, that was just a holiday in Texas. And this is just one second parallel that comes to my mind about this. For years and years, Texans celebrated Juneteenth. Then a couple other states caught on, and gradually it spread, and now it's a federal holiday, and it's recognized in every state, which is another, I think, parallel to our biblical tradition. When the Old and New Testament were, especially let's just say the New Testament was first written, it was written for a limited community. You know, Paul's letters were to specific churches, etc. It was kind of limited before it became more part of sort of a more national and then worldwide kind of movement. And now, you know, the stories, the biblical record is available to everybody, and it kind of spread that way. So I see that kind of as the same thing that happened with Juneteenth. And again, finally, Martin Luther King's letter is available to us in the same way. It was a letter originally written to the community in Birmingham, but now we can read it as an historical document and think about it in terms of what it means for our shared collective history as a Christian fellowship and also as a nation. So, with that, let me commence to reading here. So, as I said, this is not the whole letter, but it's a good chunk of it. So, just relax and, just receive and reflect on these words from Martin Luther King. This letter was written again in April of 1963. There was a time when the church was very powerful. In the time when the early Christians rejoiced at being deemed worthy to suffer for what they believed. In those days, the church was not merely a thermometer that recorded the ideas and principles of popular opinion. It was a thermostat that transformed the mores of society. Whenever the early Christians entered a town, the people in power became disturbed and immediately sought to convict the Christians for being disturbers of the peace and outside agitators. But the Christians pressed on in the conviction that they were a colony of heaven called to obey God. Small in number, they were big in commitment. They were too God-intoxicated to be astronomically intimidated. By their effort and example, they brought an end to such ancient evils as infanticide and gladiatorial contests. Things are different now. So often the contemporary church is a weak, ineffectual voice with an uncertain sound. So often it is an arch defender of the status quo. Far from being disturbed by the presence of the church, the power structure of the average community is consoled by the church's silent and often even vocal sanction of things as they are. But the judgment of God is upon the church as never before. If today's church does not recapture the sacrificial spirit of the early church, it will lose its authenticity, forfeit the loyalty of millions, and be dismissed as an irrelevant social club with no meaning for the 20th century. Every day, I meet young people whose disappointment with the church has turned into outright disgust. Perhaps I have once again been too optimistic. Is organized religion too inextricably bound to the status quo to save our nation and the world? Perhaps I must turn my faith to the inner spiritual church, the church within the church, as the true hope of the world. But again, I am thankful to God that some noble souls from the ranks of organized religion have broken loose from the paralyzing chains of conformity and joined us as active partners in the struggle for freedom. They have left their secure congregations and walked the streets of Albany, Georgia with us. They have gone down the highways of the South on torturous rides for freedom. Yes, they have gone to jail with us. Some have been dismissed from their churches, have lost the support of their bishops and fellow ministers, but they have acted in the faith that right defeated is stronger than evil triumphant. Their witness has been the spiritual salt that has preserved the true meaning of the gospel in these troubled times. They have carved a tunnel of hope through the dark mountain of disappointment. I hope the church as a whole will meet the challenge of this decisive hour. But even if the church does not come to the aid of justice, I have no despair about the future. I have no fear about the outcome of our struggle in Birmingham, even if our motives are at present misunderstood. We will reach the goal of freedom in Birmingham and all over the nation because the goal of America is freedom. Abused and scorned though we may be, our destiny is tied up with America's destiny. Before the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth, we were here. Before the pen of Jefferson etched the majestic words of the Declaration of Independence across the pages of history, we were here. For more than 2 centuries, our forebears labored in this country without wages. They made cotton king. They built the homes of their masters while suffering gross injustice and shameful humiliation. And yet, out of a bottomless vitality, they continued to thrive and develop. If the inexpressible cruelties of slavery could not stop us, the opposition we now face will surely fail. We will win our freedom because the sacred heritage of our nation and the eternal will of God are embodied in our echoing demands. I feel impelled to mention another point in your statement that has troubled me profoundly. He's referring to, a statement, the feedback that he got from the community here. You warmly commended the Birmingham police force for keeping order and, quote, preventing violence. I doubt you would have so warmly commended the police force if you had seen its dogs sink their teeth into unarmed, nonviolent Negroes. I doubt that you would so quickly commend the policemen if you were to observe their ugly and inhumane treatment of Negroes here in the city jail. If you were to watch them push and curse old Negro women and young Negro girls, if you were to see them slap and kick old Negro men and young boys, if you were to observe them, as they did on 2 occasions, refuse to give us food because we wanted to sing our grace together, I cannot join you in your praise of the Birmingham Police Department. It is true that the police have exercised a degree of discipline in handling the demonstrators. In this sense, they have conducted themselves rather non-violently in public. But for what purpose? To preserve the evil system of segregation. Over the past few years, I have consistently preached that nonviolence demands that the means we use must be as pure as the ends we seek. I have tried to make clear that it is wrong to use immoral means to attain moral ends. But now, I must affirm that it is just as wrong, or perhaps even more so, to use moral means to preserve immoral ends. Perhaps Mr. Connor and his policemen have been rather nonviolent in public, as was Chief Pritchett in Albany, Georgia. But they have used the moral means of nonviolence to maintain the immoral end of racial injustice. As T.S. Eliot has said, quote, "The last temptation is the greatest treason, to do the right deed for the wrong reason." I wish you had commended the Negro sit-inners and demonstrators of Birmingham for their sublime courage, their willingness to suffer, and their amazing discipline in the midst of great provocation. One day the South will recognize its real heroes. They will be the James Merediths, with the noble sense of purpose that enables them to face jeering and hostile mobs, and with the agonizing loneliness that characterizes the life of a pioneer. They will be old, oppressed, battered Negro women, symbolized in a 72-year-old woman in Montgomery, Alabama, who rose up with a sense of dignity and with her people decided not to ride segregated buses, and who responded with ungrammatical profundity to one who inquired about her weariness. Quote, "My feet is tired, but my soul is at rest." They will be the young high school and college students, the young ministers of the gospel, and a host of their elders, courageously and nonviolently sitting in at lunch counters and willingly going to jail for conscience sake. One day the South will know that when these disinherited children of God sat down at lunch counters, they were in reality standing up for what is best in the American dream and for the most sacred values of our Judeo-Christian heritage, thereby bringing our nation back to those great wells of democracy which were dug deep by the founding fathers in their formulation of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. Never before have I written so long a letter. I'm afraid it is much too long to take your precious time. I can assure you that it would have been much shorter if I had been writing from a comfortable desk. But what else can one do when he is alone in a narrow jail cell, other than write long letters, think long thoughts, and pray long prayers. If I have said anything in this letter that overstates the truth and indicates an unreasonable impatience, I beg you to forgive me. If I have said anything that understates the truth and indicates my having a patience that allows me to settle for anything less than brotherhood, I beg God to forgive me. I hope this letter finds you strong in the faith. I also hope that circumstances will soon make it possible for me to meet each of you, not as an integrationist or a civil rights leader, but as a fellow clergyman and Christian brother. Let us all hope that the dark clouds of racial prejudice will soon pass away and the deep fog of misunderstanding will be lifted from our fear-drenched communities. And in some not too distant tomorrow, the radiant stars of love and brotherhood will shine over our great nation with all their scintillating beauty. Yours for the cause of peace and brotherhood, Martin Luther King Jr. Amen.